A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
A team of archaeologists from the University of Oregon found something in a dry cave in southern Oregon that should not have been there. The dating results came back once and nobody believed them. So they ran the tests again on different machines. The results were identical. Human beings were living on American soil thousands of years before the textbooks said the first Americans arrived. What followed was one of the most significant and most resisted scientific debates in the history of archaeology.
Patrick O'Grady, along with other archaeologists and students at the University of Oregon, have discovered new evidence suggesting that Oregon could be the oldest site of human occupation in North America.
The story everyone learned and why it was wrong. If you went to school in North America at any point in the 20th century, you were taught a specific story about the first Americans. It went like this. A group of people crossed from Siberia into what is now Alaska approximately 13,000 years ago, walking across a land bridge exposed by lower sea levels during the last ice age. They moved south through a corridor between glaciers, spread across the continent, and became the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of North and South America. This story had a name. Scientists called it the Clovis First Model, named after an archaeological site near Clovis, New Mexico, where the most distinctive artifacts of this first migration were found in the 1930s. Clovis points are immediately recognizable objects. They are stone spear tips, carefully shaped, with a distinctive groove called a flute running up from the base on each face. They appear in the archaeological record across North America in a consistent time window and in a consistent style. For most of the 20th century, finding Clovis points at a site was the marker of first human occupation. Nothing older had been firmly established. Nothing predating 13,000 years was taken seriously. The model was not just a scientific consensus, it was an institutional orthodoxy. It was printed in textbooks and repeated in documentaries and treated in many archaeology departments as settled fact. Scientists who challenged it faced not just academic skepticism, but professional consequences. Their papers were rejected. Their samples were accused of contamination without evidence. Their careers were made more difficult by the weight of established opinion pressing down on any finding that threatened the consensus. The story was wrong. The evidence proving it wrong has been building for decades, and it is now, in the middle of the 21st century, undeniable to any honest assessment of what has been found in the ground. Paisley Caves and the DNA evidence. The Paisley Caves are a series of chambers in the cliff face of a desert landscape in south-central Oregon. They were known to archaeologists for decades before anyone excavated them seriously. The dry desert air of the region is exceptional at preserving organic material. Things that would rot or degrade within years in a humid environment can survive for thousands of years in a dry cave in the Oregon desert. What was found inside the Paisley Caves, preserved by that dry air across a span of time longer than most people can intuitively grasp, was human waste. Coprolites, the scientific term for preserved ancient feces, hardened on the cave floor by the same desiccating conditions that had kept them intact for millennia. This kind of evidence is not glamorous, but it is, in terms of what it can tell scientists, extraordinarily valuable. Inside those coprolites, preserved alongside the DNA of whatever the people who left them had eaten, was human mitochondrial DNA. This is the genetic material passed from mother to child, a direct biological record of ancestry that can be traced across thousands of years. The DNA extracted from the Paisley Cave coprolites matched mitochondrial haplogroups, A2 and B2. These are two of the founding haplogroups of Native American genetic lineages, the specific maternal lines that trace directly to the ancestors of modern indigenous peoples of North and South America. This was not the DNA of some failed migration that left no descendants. It was the DNA of the people whose descendants are still alive today. The dating method applied to this material was accelerator mass spectrometry, one of the most precise radiocarbon dating methods available. The results place the material at over 14,000 years before the present. That is at least 1,000 years before Clovis people supposedly set foot in the Americas. Clovis people were not first. The DNA proved it. The dates confirmed it. The evidence was found in Oregon, preserved by accident in conditions nobody designed, waiting for the right combination of excavation and analytical technology to reveal what it contained. Meadowcroft and the controversial scientist. The Paisley Cave findings were not the first serious challenge to the Clovis first model. That distinction belongs to a scientist named Jim Adovazio and a site in western Pennsylvania called Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. Meadowcroft is a natural overhanging stone ledge on a stream bank roughly 7 miles from the Ohio River. It is the kind of place prehistoric people would have naturally used for shelter, a dry protected overhang with water nearby and visibility across the surrounding landscape. In 1955, a local historian named Albert Miller pulled artifacts out of a groundhog hole at the base of the shelter and recognized them as significant. Systematic scientific excavation did not begin until 1973, when Jim Adovazio, an archaeologist who would spend the rest of his career fighting for what he found there, began working through the site layer by layer. Excavating an ancient site carefully means working through time in reverse. Each layer of sediment represents a period of occupation or disuse. The deeper you go, the older the material. Adovazio and his team took radiocarbon samples from multiple layers, establishing a sequence of dates that could be read against the artifacts found at each level. The radiocarbon results from the deepest layers at Meadowcroft placed human presence at the site at between 16,000 and 19,000 calibrated years ago. These dates were not ambiguous. They were not borderline cases that could be argued either way. They were thousands of years before Clovis. They placed people at a site in Pennsylvania at a time when, according to the Clovis first model, nobody should have been anywhere in the Americas. Adovazio published his findings in the journal American Antiquity in 1980, openly presenting evidence that challenged the dominant model. The response from the established archaeological community was not engagement with the evidence. It was resistance. His samples were accused of contamination. The accusation was made without specific evidence identifying any particular mechanism of contamination. His papers were effectively sidelined. A survey of working archaeologists conducted in the years following his publication found that only 38% agreed with his dates. Another 38% were unsure. The rest rejected them outright. One archaeologist who supported Adovazio named this pattern Clovis primacy syndrome. He described the institutional resistance as anachronistic and futile. He was right. The findings at Meadowcroft have since been confirmed and extended by subsequent research, and the contamination accusations were never substantiated with specific evidence. Adovazio was right in 1980. It took most of the scientific community 3 more decades to acknowledge it.
In 2012, we found this tooth enamel with this stone tool underneath it. And so this is the one that tested positive for bison blood, but it was actually found buried underneath camel tooth enamel.
Rimrock Draw and the Ancient Tool. 70 miles from the Paisley Caves, in the high desert of Harney County, Oregon, near a small community called Riley, a site called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter has been yielding evidence since excavations began in 2011 under archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady of the University of Oregon. Rimrock Draw is a natural overhang in the landscape, the kind of sheltered depression that prehistoric people moving across the desert would recognize as a useful stopping point. What makes it scientifically significant is a geological feature that provides an unusually reliable dating marker. Embedded in the sediment at Rimrock Draw is a layer of white volcanic ash. This ash was deposited by a Mount St. Helens eruption that geologists have dated to between 15,400 and 15,600 years ago. The volcanic ash layer is a fixed point in time. Any material found below the ash is definitively older than 15,400 years. Any material above it is younger. The ash is a natural clock embedded in the sediment. The O'Grady team found material below the ash layer. They found 27 fragments of tooth enamel from Ice Age animals, extinct species whose presence in the site established that the deposits were genuinely ancient. One of those tooth fragments came from an Ice Age camel, a species that went extinct in North America thousands of years ago. Another came from Bison antiquus, the larger ancestor of the modern American buffalo, also long extinct. The dating of the camel and bison tooth fragments, run independently twice with identical results, place them at approximately 21,000 to 22,000 years ago. This was already 10,000 years before Clovis. But the most significant find was not the teeth. 10 centimeters below the tooth fragments, meaning older than the teeth, the team found a stone tool. It was made from a material called orange chalcedony, a glassy form of agate that produces sharp working edges when shaped carefully. The tool was not a simple flake. It had multiple working surfaces, a curved cutting edge, a flat scraping edge, and a saw-toothed edge worn smooth from heavy use. One archaeologist on the team compared it to an early Swiss Army knife. The tool belongs to a style called the Western stem tradition, a way of making stone implements characterized by long blades with weak shoulders and rounded bases. This style looks nothing like Clovis points. It follows different design principles and represents a completely different technological tradition. Its presence at Rimrock Draw, found below material dated to over 21,000 years, places a distinct and sophisticated tool-making tradition in Oregon at a time when the Clovis first model insisted no human being should have been anywhere in North America. White sands and the footprint evidence. The evidence from Paisley Caves, Meadowcroft, and Rimrock Draw was compelling, though still open to technical debate, especially when it came to indirect material evidence. By contrast, the discoveries at White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico involve direct human footprints preserved in ancient lake sediments, making them far harder to dismiss. White Sands is a vast field of white gypsum dunes covering the bed of the extinct Lake Otero, which existed during the last ice age when the region was wetter and cooler. In 2009, researchers discovered something extraordinary: 61 fossilized human footprints impressed into the ancient lakebed mud, preserved with remarkable detail. The prints clearly show toes, arches, and heel structure, and include both children and adults moving across the wet surface at what appears to have been a brisk walking pace. Alongside them were tracks of extinct Ice Age animals such as Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, confirming the ecosystem they shared with humans. The footprints are unmistakably human, made by people walking across a wet lakebed during the late Pleistocene, roughly between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, according to multiple dating methods. The first radiocarbon study in 2021 dated seeds from spiral ditch plants found in the same sediment layers, producing ages of about 21 to 23,000 years before present. Critics argued that the seeds could have absorbed old carbon from groundwater, potentially skewing the radiocarbon results, a known issue in certain wetland environments. A second round tested conifer pollen, which is less susceptible to groundwater contamination, and it produced the same age range of 21 to 23,000 years. The most comprehensive analysis, published in Science Advances in 2025, examined pollen, seeds, and organic lake sediments from multiple independent samples across the site. All three lines of evidence converged on the same conclusion. Humans were present at White Sands between 21 and 23,000 years ago. This places human occupation of North America at least 8,000 years earlier than the traditionally accepted Clovis horizon. Taken together, the White Sands footprints provide direct, physical evidence that humans were already present in the Americas during the peak of the last ice age. and that they moved through wetland environments alongside megafauna, leaving a continuous record that has now been independently confirmed through multiple dating approaches and separate material sources within the same geological context across the site and its sediments today. The Cerruti Mastodon and a controversial date. The findings at Paisley Caves, Meadowcroft, Rimrock Draw, and White Sands all push the human presence in the Americas back thousands of years before Clovis. They are significant, controversial at times, but increasingly supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. Cerruti Mastodon stands apart because its proposed age and interpretation are far more extreme than any other site discussed. The site was discovered in 1992 during freeway construction in Southern California when workers uncovered large fossilized bone fragments. Paleontologists were brought in to assess the find and quickly realized the remains belonged to a mastodon, an extinct Ice Age proboscidean. At first glance, the bones seemed typical of regional Pleistocene deposits, but their context soon raised questions. What made the Cerruti site scientifically unusual was the condition of the mastodon bones. Several long bones exhibited spiral fractures, a pattern that only forms when fresh bone is broken while still retaining organic flexibility. Such fractures are commonly associated with deliberate breakage rather than natural post-depositional damage. The break suggested forceful impact on recently deceased remains. Nearby the bones were 5 large cobbles that did not match local sedimentary transport patterns. Their size and weight made fluvial movement implausible. The stones showed battering and edge wear consistent with use as hammerstones and anvils. Their placement relative to the bones suggested repeated striking actions, consistent with marrow extraction behavior observed in known prehistoric human sites worldwide. The age of the site was determined using uranium-thorium radiometric dating applied to carbonate materials associated with the bones. This method is independent of radiocarbon dating and can extend far deeper into the Pleistocene time range. In 2017, results published in Nature reported an age of approximately 130,700 years for the deposits containing the mastodon remains. This result places the site far outside the accepted timeline for human presence in North America. If the interpretation is correct, it would predate anatomically modern humans by tens of thousands of years, and even precede many models for the emergence of Homo sapiens as a distinct species. It therefore implies either an unknown hominin presence in the Americas or a fundamentally incorrect interpretation of the site's formation. The response from mainstream archaeology has been cautious and largely skeptical. Many researchers question whether the bone damage and cobble arrangement can be securely attributed to human activity rather than natural geological processes. While the study was published in a leading scientific journal, it has not been widely incorporated into mainstream models of early human migration, reflecting ongoing debate and unresolved methodological concerns. Taken together, the Cerruti Mastodon site remains one of the most controversial archaeological claims in North America. It stands in contrast to other early sites because of its extreme antiquity and the implications it carries. Whether ultimately accepted or rejected, it has forced researchers to re-examine assumptions about human capability, migration, and the deep history of the Americas, ensuring that the debate over early human presence continues to evolve as new evidence emerges in the future over time, going forward. The coastal route and the boat people. All of the sites discussed so far challenge the Clovis first timeline, but the White Sands footprints and the Cerruti Mastodon bones also challenge the route. If people were in New Mexico 22,000 years ago and in California 130,000 years ago, they did not arrive by walking down an ice-free corridor through Canada during the last ice age. That corridor did not exist yet. They came by another way. The coastal migration hypothesis proposes that at least some of the earliest Americans came not overland, but by sea, traveling along the coastline of the Pacific from northeastern Asia. moving camp to camp following the resources available along the shore: fish, shellfish, seabirds, and marine mammals. This route would have been possible at different points in the prehistoric past, when sea levels and coastal conditions allowed it. It would not have required a land bridge or an ice-free corridor. It would have required boats and the knowledge to use them on open coastal water. The evidence that early humans were capable of exactly this kind of maritime travel has come from an unexpected location. The island of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea has been an island for approximately 5 million years. It was never connected to the mainland by a land bridge at any point in human prehistory. Any human beings or their ancestors who reached Crete had to cross at least 40 miles of open sea to get there. Stone tools have been found at 2 sites on Crete dated to between 130,000 and 700,000 years ago. The tools resemble those produced by Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, early human relatives who predated modern Homo sapiens by hundreds of thousands of years. The research team led by Thomas Strasser and Eleni Panagopoulou, who documented these findings, drew a direct conclusion. Beings who crossed 40 miles of open water in the Mediterranean, hundreds of thousands of years ago, had purposefully built watercraft capable of open sea travel. All assumptions about early maritime migration, not just in the Mediterranean but globally, had to be reconsidered. The genetic evidence adds another dimension to the coastal route hypothesis. A specific mitochondrial DNA lineage designated D4H, when traced back through populations across Asia and the Americas, points to northern coastal China as its origin. The data suggests 2 separate migration waves into the Americas with different timing and different routes. The first wave, estimated at approximately 26,000 years ago, appears to have traveled by boat along the coastline of the Pacific. The route went from coastal China to Japan and then progressively across the northern Pacific, moving camp to camp over generations, following the food resources of the coastal ocean environment. This was not a single journey. It was a generational process of coastal expansion, each group moving a little further along the shore, establishing temporary camps, and eventually producing descendants who pushed further still. The slow, generational nature of the process explains why it left genetic signatures that trace back to coastal China rather than to the interior populations that are associated with the later land bridge migration. The second wave, estimated at approximately 15,000 years ago, took the overland route across the land bridge. This later wave is associated with the populations most clearly linked to the Clovis archaeological tradition. They were not the first arrivals. They were latecomers who followed routes and inhabited a continent that had already been occupied, in some areas for thousands of years, by the descendants of the earlier coastal migrants. The stone tool evidence supports this picture. Specific tool-making techniques appear across coastal China, Japan, and the Americas, in the same forms and using the same methods. Blade shapes and point designs that are consistent across this vast geographical range suggest a traceable tradition of craft knowledge that traveled with the people who made these tools as they moved along the Pacific coast over thousands of years. Why institutions resisted and how they lost. The resistance to pre-Clovis evidence is a story worth understanding on its own terms, not because it makes the scientific community look bad, but because it illuminates how scientific consensus can calcify in ways that slow the recognition of genuine discoveries. The Clovis first model had been dominant for so long and had been invested in by so many careers and so many publications that contradicting evidence was initially processed through a lens of skepticism that was not applied equally to evidence supporting the consensus. When Jim Adovasio published the Meadowcroft dates in 1980, the accusations of contamination did not come with specific mechanisms. They came because the dates were impossible given the accepted model. The impossibility of the dates, within the framework of Clovis first, was treated as evidence that something must be wrong with the dates, rather than as evidence that something might be wrong with the framework. This is a recognizable pattern in the history of science. it is not unique to archaeology. New findings that contradict established consensus face a higher burden of proof than findings that confirm it. This asymmetric skepticism is partly appropriate because extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence, and partly a reflection of institutional inertia, which protects established positions not because they are necessarily correct, but because they are established. What happened in the case of pre-Clovis evidence is that the extraordinary evidence kept arriving. The Meadowcroft dates, the Paisley Cave, DNA, the Rimrock draw tool below the volcanic ash, the White Sands footprints. Each finding was resisted in turn. Each one accumulated its own body of supporting evidence, and eventually the weight of accumulated sites, each independently confirmed by multiple methods, made the continued defense of Clovis First untenable. The Clovis First model has not simply been revised, it has been abandoned by the scientific community as a whole. The question is no longer whether humans arrived before Clovis. That question is settled. The questions now are who they were, where they came from, by what routes they traveled, and how many separate migration waves may have contributed to the founding populations of the Americas. What the ground still holds. The sites that have already been found are not the full story. They may not even be the most significant part of it. The Ceruti Mastodon site's date of 130,000 years sits without a credible refutation in the published literature, but also without the follow-up investigation that a finding of that magnitude would seem to demand. The evidence is physical, the bones and the cobblestones and the specific fracture patterns, and it points to a presence in the Americas so old that it requires a complete reimagining of human prehistory, not just in the Americas, but globally. Who was in California 130,000 years ago? How did they get there? Where did they go? What happened to them? These questions have no answers yet because the site that raised them has not been seriously followed up. The coastal migration route that the genetic and tool evidence supports runs along a coastline that is now largely underwater. Sea levels during the last ice age were significantly lower than they are today, and the coastline that ancient coastal migrants would have traveled along is now submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean. Archaeological investigation of underwater sites is possible, but expensive and technically demanding. The prehistoric campsites that the first coastal Americans would have left along the now submerged Pacific shoreline may still be there, preserved in the cold water and sediment of the ocean floor, waiting for the technology and funding to find them. The pattern of discovery in American archaeology over the past several decades suggests that each new excavation of a site that receives serious scientific attention produces findings that complicate the existing picture. Meadowcroft produced dates that were impossible within the Clovis model. Paisley Caves produced DNA that settled the pre-Clovis question definitively. White Sands produced footprints that even the most committed skeptics eventually had to accept. Rimrock Draw produced a tool below volcanic ash whose age could not be argued away. The next discovery is already waiting in the ground somewhere. In a dry cave in the desert, in a layer of sediment below a volcanic ash marker, in the preserved mud of an ancient lake bed, in a site that has not yet been excavated by a team with the right combination of curiosity, methodology, and persistence. The story of the first Americans is not finished. It is being written.
The discovery is teaching us about more than just our past.
It tells us about how people respond to climate changes over time. And we're in one right now that we need all the help understanding that we can get.
What this means for human history. The implications of what has been found in Oregon and New Mexico and Pennsylvania and California extend beyond archaeology. They touch on questions about human movement, human capability, and the assumptions that have organized not just scientific understanding, but cultural and political narratives about who belongs in North America and how long people have been here. The indigenous peoples of North and South America have traditions that describe their connection to the land as ancient. extending back to the time of creation. These traditions were dismissed by European colonizers and later by a scientific establishment that placed human arrival in the Americas at 13,000 years ago, a relatively recent date that implicitly framed indigenous presence as recent rather than primordial. The evidence now places human presence in the Americas at a minimum of 22,000 years ago, and possibly at 130,000 years ago, with roots that include maritime travel by coastal peoples whose descendants became some of the founding populations of the continent. This evidence is not a validation of specific cultural traditions in a literal sense. It is a recognition that the scientific consensus that placed human arrival in the Americas at 13,000 years ago was wrong, and that it was wrong in ways that happened to be politically convenient for narratives that minimize the depth and antiquity of indigenous connection to the land. The first Americans were not a single group of people who crossed a land bridge 13,000 years ago. They were multiple groups, arriving by multiple routes, over a span of time that may extend back further than any current model can fully account for. They were more diverse in origin, more varied in their routes of arrival, and more ancient in their presence than the textbooks taught. The Clovis first model was not just an archaeological mistake. It was a historical mistake with consequences that outlasted the scientific consensus that supported it. The correction of that mistake is ongoing. The evidence is being gathered site by site, date by date, fragment by fragment. The dry cave in Oregon that started this story was holding its secrets for over 14,000 years. The volcanic ash at Rimrock Draw was holding its secrets for over 15,000. The lake bed at White Sands was holding footprints for over 21,000. The ground is still holding more. The Clovis first model that dominated American archaeology for most of the 20th century has been overturned by evidence from dry caves, volcanic ash, lake bed footprints, and radiocarbon dates that kept coming back with the same impossible numbers. Humans were in the Americas thousands of years before the textbooks admitted. The routes they took were more diverse than anyone accepted. The next discovery is already in the ground somewhere, waiting. If this is worth following, subscribe and stay with us for what comes next.